The idea of an afterlife is central to almost all religion, and the idea of heaven, hell, and how you get there has been depicted in art across the world.
Our anticipation of what lies beyond the grave has ranged from the purity of a higher place to the gruesome depths below. But why do we have these broadly shared ideas? Is it because of a deep spiritual desire to envisage a world beyond this, or is it society trying to police individual behaviour? In this series, I'm going to be looking at images inspired by the world's major religions. I'll ask how people have encountered the prospect of life after death, and I'll look at the role that art has played in developing human faith and imagination. I'll start with that fateful moment when everything hangs in the balance, the moment which determines whether your life beyond this will be one of bliss or torment.
Paintings like this appeared in churches all over Europe. Incredibly powerful images where Christ at the centre sits in judgment and determines who will be damned and who will be saved. And the picture has this amazing upward-downward clockwise thrust, where on the left-hand side of the picture there's this sense of bursting out of the grave. And then on the right-hand side of the picture there are those who are damned, quite literally, being swallowed into the gaping mouth of hell. This particular image of the Last Judgment was painted around 1470 in the Church of St Thomas in Salisbury under the shadow of the great cathedral. And it was intended to convey a very clear message. In effect, this is a signpost in this life for what will happen in the afterlife. If you live a good life, you'll be saved. If you live a sinful life, you'll be damned. And the whole idea of judgment becomes a fact of life for people throughout the Middle Ages. In fact, almost the entire population of Europe believed without question that judgment would happen on the moment of their death, that it would be swift, and that its consequences would be everlasting. But the whole notion of judgment had its origins a lot earlier than this.
Some of the earliest images of judgment in art come from an ancient culture preoccupied by death and the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians built great pyramids to honour their dead kings and mummified corpses to ensure immortality. At the centre of their elaborate concept of the afterlife was a final judgment of the soul. In order to make the passage of the deceased through the afterlife as easy as possible, the ancient Egyptians devised a kind of travel guide to the underworld known as the Book of the Dead. This Book of the Dead was produced about 1300 years before the birth of Christ. And it was produced for a royal scribe named Junifer, who lived in Thebes. And we know he was a man of some status because, in fact, the craftsmanship and the artistry of this book is of the highest calibre. And what we see here is Junifer, dressed in white, being led towards judgment by this jackal-headed character called Anubis. And Anubis is here, then in the next sequence, shown balancing the scales. And so what we have is a story, a narrative unfolding from left to right, where you can see the heart of Junifer here in a jar being weighed against a feather, a symbol of truth and what is right. Now what has just happened is that Junifer has had to answer 42 questions and make 42 statements about his behaviour in his life. And it's that will be used as the basis for this judgment. And if the judgment goes against him, this hybrid monster with a crocodile's head and a lion's body and a hippopotamus's rear end, known as Ammit, or the devourer of the dead, will gobble up his heart. But of course, invariably, in Books of the Dead, there's a happy ending. And what we see in the next sequence is Junifer triumphant, being presented to Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. And in the end, judgment has gone for him, and of course, paradise awaits. In many ways, the ancient Egyptians' elaborate form of judgment set the stage for judgment throughout history. Here, in a culture thousands of years older than Christianity, the notion that in death the individual must account for their behaviour in life is already well established. But the afterlife hasn't always involved the notion of judgment. In the early books of the Old Testament, or what in Judaism is known as the Torah, there was the idea of Sheol. Sheol was a place where everybody went when they died, regardless of how they'd acted during their life. However, this began to change from the 6th century BC. Beginning with the sack of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the Jewish people faced a struggle for survival, which coloured their understanding of life and death. By the time of the birth of Jesus Christ, the Jewish lands of ancient Israel and Judea were under Roman domination. In an atmosphere of rebellion and insecurity, many felt that the end of the world was fast approaching. Various sects believed a Messiah would come down from heaven and sit in judgment over humanity, meaning that those who sought to oppress the Jewish people would be damned in the next life. Although many fine examples of Jewish art exist, Judaism is primarily a religion of the Word. The faithful don't depend on images for their religious understanding. All Jewish spiritual life is instead focused on the Torah, the Holy Book.
Judgment and particularly hell are not explicitly pictured, but it has partly to do with problems surrounding the image of the judge, because who is the judge? It would be God. And in Judaism, God is ineffable and invisible, and you cannot make an image of God, and therefore you cannot have the heavenly judge sitting in judgment.
Around the same time, the great religions of South and East Asia were grappling with similar problems surrounding life and death, good and evil. However, beliefs concerning the afterlife were dominated by a quite different idea: reincarnation. In this system, the individual is continually reborn into a series of different lives, anything from an ant to a demigod. One religion in which reincarnation plays an important role is Buddhism, a faith that emerged in the 6th century BC in northern India and which later spread throughout East Asia.
In Buddhism, the life that each of us is living is actually just part of an endless cycle of rebirth known as samsara, and at death, each individual has to face the king of hell, known as Yama in the Chinese and Tibetan tradition, and Emma in the Japanese tradition, and it's that which is depicted on this scroll. Now this in fact is a Japanese image. It's a 19th century copy of a 13th century scroll that still exists today in a temple in Japan near the city of Kyoto. And these scrolls were a form of education. They were aids, if you like, to a form of preaching known as etoki, where pictures were used as well as words to enlighten, or rather illuminate and educate a lay congregation as to what was going to happen to them if they didn't live a good life. And that is all here in the foreground, where all manner of torture and pain is depicted. We see Emma here at the top, this ferocious-looking god, who surveys a scene below, and in a way, although he's presiding over proceedings, he's not actually judging, because what happens is that he presents a mirror. This is the mirror of karma, where this poor hapless creature who's been made to face up to this mirror is looking at what he has done during his life. And karma, the accumulation of good and bad deeds during life, is what will decide his fate. In effect, this is the judge. And so this will decide whether or not he has an easy or a difficult afterlife.
Religion in ancient East Asia wasn't as fixed a doctrine as in other regions of the world. In fact, when Buddhism arrived in China from India, it combined with existing beliefs and ideas such as Taoism and Confucianism. One idea Buddhism encountered was the concept of a heavenly government and bureaucracy. Here, your deeds are documented by supernatural clerks, and at death, you are hauled up in front of a panel of judges who consider your case.
You find that the people who run the sort of supernatural bureaucracy are keeping files on us all the time, and sometimes we could end up in hell or wherever just because of a filing error. And from quite early on in China you find stories about people who revive and tell their relatives that they ended up in hell, but then somebody found out it was just a clerical error in the filing system.
But the religion that took images of judgment to new levels found its spiritual home here in Rome.
The idea of judgment, whether you'd behaved well enough in this life to warrant going to heaven or badly enough to be damned for eternity in hell, features strongly in many religions. But it was Christianity that emerged from the turmoil of Israel and Judea in the 1st century, and which later went on to dominate Europe, that put the idea and the image of judgment at centre stage.
Christianity centres on the belief that Jesus Christ was the saviour of humankind. His arrival was expected to mark the end of time, at which the dead would be resurrected and judged. When this didn't happen, the followers of Christ focused on the anticipated second coming and the last judgment that would follow. Although the idea of last judgment quickly became integral to Christian belief, it took some time before any depiction of it appeared in churches. One of the earliest examples is in Ravenna, in northeastern Italy, in the Byzantine church of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo. The mosaic, made around 425 AD, takes St. Matthew's Gospel as its inspiration. Matthew used the metaphor of Christ as shepherd to describe the Last Judgment. The goats, on the right, are due to be cast into everlasting fire, whilst the sheep, on the left, are destined for everlasting life. But despite the mention of fire and punishment in the Gospel, none is alluded to in this image. It's really very tame, certainly in comparison to the images of the Last Judgment which were to follow. The turning point for such images was the passing of the millennium, a time when most Christians expected the world to end.
When it didn't happen with the passing of the millennium, I think the church had to do something about it. And consequently, I think this triggers an enormous degree of artistic production.
This depiction of the Last Judgment was begun in the late 11th century in Venice's first cathedral, the Church of Santa Maria Assunta on the island of Torcello. It marks a crucial point in the development of Christian art. Like the image in Ravenna, it's rendered in mosaic, but it's far more elaborate in composition and detail. It contains many of the elements that would appear in later images of the Last Judgment. The work's multi-layered. Christ victorious presides over the scene at the top. He brandishes a cross as a symbol of his triumph over death, whilst pulling Adam from limbo. Below, Christ reappears in a more mystical guise. He's framed by an almond-shaped aura called a mandorla, which shows his otherness from the rest of us. Mary and St. John are closest to him, and he's flanked by apostles, prophets, and church fathers. And below that, we see St. Michael as he assesses the balance of judgment using scales which recall those from ancient Egyptian art. But here the consequences are much more explicit. Those who've committed the 7 deadly sins are punished accordingly, and they're damned forever. Inside this church in the northern Italian town of Padua is one of the most famous Last Judgments in the history of art. Giotto di Bondoni's great fresco, created at the beginning of the 14th century. Giotto takes the power and the drama from the mosaic in Torcello, but simplifies the structure. There are 3 main layers, and only one image of Christ, who presides over everything. Even more striking is the sense of graphic realism which Giotto uses to give the work a much stronger psychological edge. From Christ seated in judgment at the centre of the image, 4 great streams of fire thrust the sinful into hell, where Satan sits and stuffs the bodies into his mouth, whilst excreting others out. The whole thing is a vicious, visceral cycle of devourment, defecation and damnation. And as the viewer prepares to leave the church, the image is almost within reach, serving as a reminder of how not to live. On the other side of the divide, marked by Christ and below him the cross, the blessed have burst free from their tombs and line up to be guided by angels to Christ and paradise. Perhaps as a reward for his pious and powerful painting, maybe as an act of faith and hope, Giotto, seen here in the yellow hat, places himself amidst those who are saved. When we look at a Last Judgment like Giotto's, we're viewing a pictorial sermon and an unequivocal statement of Christian doctrine. For the medieval faithful, there was a miraculous sense of the judgment taking place in their midst. But why did such spectacular images of the Last Judgment become such a prominent feature of Christian doctrine?
I think the notion of judgment, salvation and damnation was part and parcel of church control, and I think the controlling force of the church seized upon the need in people to have some degree of pleasure in the future, because their lives were probably so hellish and reality was so rough and strife-ridden that they needed to hold on to this idea that ultimately there would be something better.
The power of the Catholic Church was underpinned by the control it had over people's imaginations. At key moments in the Church's history, such as the Reformation, art has been employed to strengthen its position. By the beginning of the 16th century, the idea of the Last Judgment in art seemed to have run its course. The spirit of the Renaissance favoured much more uplifting religious art, and secular art was flourishing as never before. But then came the revolt known as the Reformation, which spread throughout Northern Europe. And it changed things, forcing the Pope here in Rome to try and find an artist who could produce a visual manifesto of the core principles of the Church. And he commissioned, in the end, the most famous Last Judgment ever made. Michelangelo's Last Judgment forms the culmination of his great cycle of frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, works that represent for many the pinnacle of Western art. Here Michelangelo fuses classical beauty with Christian iconography, not least in the figure of Christ, who reads as a combination of Greek God and New Testament Saviour, a muscular hero dispensing judgment with superhuman authority. The traditional divisions between heaven and hell are blurred. Michelangelo's figures are gathered here and there in groups, but others seem isolated. It's an endless swirl of judgment, a world beyond human understanding, and yet it's painted in such a way as to seem frighteningly real. The power of Michelangelo's Last Judgment ultimately stems from the rendering of human flesh. Michelangelo was a sensualist whose work celebrates the physical essence of the stuff of which human beings are made. Here, though, he's painting a personal penance where the flesh of those saved is luminous, but that of the damned is deathly grey, bordering on putrid. As we know from his diaries and the accounts of those close to him, as Michelangelo grew older, he developed a growing terror of the sins of the flesh. His Last Judgment, therefore, was both an act of personal atonement and a phenomenal proclamation of the power of the Catholic Church.
In many parts of Europe, by the 1530s, the Protestant Reformation put an end to the more fantastical depictions of the Last Judgment. Indeed, many reformers believed that religious art itself was a form of blasphemy. And in effect, art became a battleground. This wonderful image of the Last Judgment here in the Church of St. Thomas in Salisbury, until recently, was covered in whitewash, an act of cultural vandalism that swept Protestant England during the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and of course Queen Elizabeth, where the idea of religious imagery somehow was deemed to get in the way of direct communication with God, and the stress was on the Bible, on the Scriptures, which begin, of course, in the beginning was the Word.
The impact of the Reformation on art was considerable. In the regions of Northern Europe, which adopted the new Protestant faith, artists moved away from depictions of religious subjects. In the centuries that followed, portraits, landscapes, and images of the classical past came to dominate the artistic repertoire. Political power changed hands from religious authorities and divinely appointed monarchs to parliaments, presidents, and dictators. Images of the Last Judgment no longer had the same power to control the human imagination. As man moved closer to the centre of his perceived universe, earthly courts increasingly took precedence over heavenly ones. In the last 200 years, a few artists have tackled the subject of the Last Judgment. They drew inspiration from religious subjects, but reinterpreted them in more mystical and melodramatic ways, as part of the movement known as Romanticism. This picture by the 19th century British artist John Martin is a wonderfully overblown example of the romantic imagination at work. Martin's image is directly inspired by St. John's account of the Last Judgment, where the great day of wrath occurs. On the right-hand side we see the forces of evil, including bishops and kings as well as the whore of Babylon, who slide agonizingly into the vast chasm in the dead centre of the picture. In the plains of heaven are the blessed, including numerous artists and poets whose identity Martin made clear in a chart published to go with the picture. Behind, the holy city of Jerusalem is visible, a shimmering white architectural fantasy, brilliantly rendered as an ethereal dreamscape. The entire scene is presided over by a dazzling Christ on the throne of judgment, flanked by his heavenly hosts. The work was almost a form of travelling theatre. It toured England in the mid-1850s, and thousands went to see it. But Martin wasn't highly regarded by his fellow artists. John Constable described his work as pantomime, and others saw him not as a devout painter, but a religious fanatic whom they dubbed Mad Martin. Here, then, is the Last Judgment reduced in some quarters to little more than a freak show. Over the past century and a half, modernism has shown little interest in Christian subject matter. But recently, there's been renewed interest in religious art, and The Last Judgement has reappeared, albeit in a rather different form. Threshold to the Kingdom is a slow-motion video installation made by the British artist Mark Wallinger in 2000. It's shot at the arrivals gate of London City Airport and shows a procession of travellers emerging from passport control through customs and then walking through the glass doors, quite literally crossing the threshold into the United Kingdom. But Wallinger's clearly making religious parallels. The work's accompanied by the soundtrack of Allegri's Miserere and the words of Psalm 51. "Have mercy on me, O God, after thy great goodness. Wash me thoroughly from my wickedness and cleanse me from my sin." Suddenly, the soulless location of an airport can be seen as a threshold from one place to another, from one world to another. Even the security officer could be seen as a latter-day St. Peter, the key holder at the gateway of heaven. Of course, Wallinger's work's not to be taken literally, but rather than offer the fantastical visions of past images of the Last Judgement, where the artist makes the leap of imagination for the viewer, here Wallinger reminds us that art requires a leap of faith too, and it also has the power to reveal parallel visions and other ways of seeing, and reminds us that even though the idea of Judgment Day is less evident in the visual world around us, it still reverberates throughout Western culture and beyond.